He was more ghost than dog, a shadow lurking among the ruins of a collapsed world. Locals whispered about a strange shape moving through the wreckage of Raven's Mill, but no one dared get close. Until the day, a broken man stood still, and the ghost looked back. Ghost at Raven's Mill. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from. We ring from every corner of the country. The mill had been silent for 15 years, but something still moved within its bones. Jake Rivers, a former firefighter haunted by memories of flame and loss, wasn't looking for anything that day. He only wanted quiet, but fate had a different planone wrapped in fur, fear, and forgotten commands. White Pine, Montana, was the kind of town people forgot. Tucked beneath a crescent of jagged hills and blanketed in pine forests so dense they swallowed sound, it hadn't seen growth since the last train carted away timber and ore. It was early autumn, the kind that hinted at snow with its breath, and the wind that whipped through the valley carried with it the scent of rust, rain, and something older. The sky was a heavy slate, clouds pushing low like a ceiling that wanted to fall. Jake Rivers, 38, moved through the brittle grass beside the old Raven's Mill as if retracing some forgotten path. He had the build of a man who'd once been carved from muscle, but time and grief had softened him around the edges. His hair, once coal black, was now peppered with gray, usually hidden beneath a worn navy beanie. There was a limp in his right leg, barely noticeable unless you were looking, a souvenir from the fire on Harris Ridge that ended his career and left 3 of his closest brothers in ash. Jake didn't talk about that day. He didn't talk much at all anymore. He came out here often, walking the perimeter of the abandoned sawmill like it held answers, or maybe just because no one else would follow. Raven's Mill had been the lifeblood of White Pine once. Now it was little more than skeletons of corrugated metal and sagging beams, every pane of glass long since shattered. The locals claimed it was haunted. Jake didn't believe in ghosts until that day. He saw it first as movement, not dramatic, not wild, just something shifting in the shadows where the mill wall buckled in on itself. He squinted. Probably a raccoon or coyote. But as he stepped closer, the shape resolved, and Jake's breath caught. It was a dog, or what was left of one. Lying half-submerged in soot and rust, it was filthy, its fur matted and clumped with burrs and old blood. Bones jutted sharply beneath patchy fur, and the creature's eye samber, glassy, followed his every movement with a feral stillness. It didn't bark, it didn't growl, it didn't run, it just stared. Jake crouched, keeping his distance. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. His voice was unused, gravelly. "You don't look so good." The dog flinched at the sound, shrinking deeper into the debris, but still didn't flee. Jake noted the raised haunches, the barely visible shiver in its ribs, the way it kept its left front paw curled beneath it. Injured, abandoned, dying maybe. Jake stood slowly, backing away. "All right," he said gently, more to himself than the animal. "I'll come back." His cabin was a 15-minute walk up the slope, nestled just off the tree line with a small porch and a rusting mailbox that leaned like it had given up. Inside, he didn't bother turning on the lights. He moved with quiet efficiency, pulling open the fridge and wrapping up half a piece of smoked brisket he'd made 2 nights ago. A battered metal bowl was filled with tap water. He paused at the door, eyeing the storm clouds gathering beyond the hills. Something in his chest pulled tight, and he grabbed his old army field jacket before stepping out again. When Jake returned to the mill, the dog was still there. It had shifted slightly, now partially hidden behind a rusted drum barrel, but those same haunted eyes tracked his every step. He set the meat down on a flat stone 10 feet away, then the water beside it, and slowly retreated to the shadow of a leaning wall. Then he waited. The wind picked up, and with it came the dry scent of pine and decay. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and then, finally, movement. The dog limped forward, favoring its left leg heavily. Each step was tentative, shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. It paused near the meat, nose twitching, then grabbed it with a sudden motion and darted back. It devoured the food in seconds, then lapped at the water like it hadn't drunk in days. Jake didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. The ritual repeated for 4 more days. Each time the dog crept a little closer to him, lingered a little longer. By the 5th day, it no longer bolted when Jake sat nearby. It still didn't let him touch it, but the distance between them had shrunk from 10 feet to 4. That's when he named it. "You're a ghost, you know that?" he said softly. The dog looked up. "Creeping around like you're not there at all. But I see you." Its ears twitched at his voice. Not understanding, maybe, or maybe remembering something from another life. Jake smiled, for the first time in what felt like years. "Yeah," he said. "Ghost suits you." As twilight bled into the sky, painting the clouds with bruised purple and gold, Jake stood slowly and walked home. Behind him, the dog didn't follow, but neither did it disappear into the ruins. It would be tomorrow, or the next day. Jake had learned to be patient. You don't rush the wounded. That night, a storm rolled in. Wind battered the sides of his cabin, rain pelting the windows in angry fists. Jake stood by the glass, watching lightning flicker over the silhouette of the mill far below. Somewhere in that ruin, a ghost huddled alone. He grabbed a flashlight and his jacket. Because some ghosts didn't need exercising, they needed saving. The rain didn't let up as Jake navigated the winding trail from Raven's Mill back to his cabin. His jacket was soaked through, water streaming down his neck, and mud clung to his boots like guilt. Cradled in his arms was the broken creature he'd come to call Ghost. The dog weighed less than he should have, just skin, bone, and whatever stubborn spirit kept him alive this long. Ghost trembled, but made no sound, his eyes unfocused, head resting against Jake's shoulder like he'd finally surrendered. By the time they reached the porch, the storm had grown violent, thunder cracking overhead like artillery fire. Jake eased the door open with his hip, kicked it shut behind him, and laid Ghost gently on an old blanket near the fireplace. The dog didn't resist. He simply curled in on himself, tail tucked, body rigid with fear. Jake moved quickly, lighting the fire, bringing the room to life with soft flickering heat. The sudden warmth made Ghost flinch. Jake grabbed a towel, kneeling beside the dog. "It's all right," he murmured. "No more cold, not tonight." As he gently dried Ghost's fur, he noticed more than just grime, scars. Not the kind animals get from fights or accidents, these were precise, symmetrical. One, a long ridge down the dog's right flank, looked like an old burn. Another, smaller, was circular and pink, raised like a brand. But what stopped Jake cold were the twin dark lines running parallel down Ghost's back. Uniform, clean, too clean. He stood and picked up the phone. Rachel Kane had once been the closest thing Jake had to a confidant. Now in her early 40s, Rachel was the town's only veterinarian, running a modest clinic on Main Street. She was tall, with strawberry blonde hair always tied in a low braid, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that could talk down an angry rancher or a terrified dog. Her laugh was rare these days, softened by years of watching pain walk through her clinic doors on 4 legs. Jake hadn't spoken to her much since Harris Ridge. He hadn't spoken to anyone much. But tonight, as he dialed her number, her voice on the line was like a rope tossed to a drowning man. "Rachel, it's Jake. I need a favor. Tell me it's not you bleeding this time. It's a dog." A pause. Then, "Bring him in." Jake wrapped Ghost in an old quilt and drove the short distance into town. The clinic lights were off, but Rachel was waiting inside, a warm halo of yellow light pooling behind her in the doorway. She looked the same, tired but sharp, her steel blue eyes scanning him and the bundle in his arms, like she was assessing damage before he even said a word. "You weren't kidding," she muttered as he laid Ghost on the exam table. Her hands moved quickly, practiced. She checked pulse, pupils, temperature, gently prodding ribs and limbs. When she reached Ghost's back, she froze. "This isn't from another dog," she said, voice low. "This is something else." "I know." Rachel pulled out a small scanner, sweeping it over Ghost's shoulders. Nothing. She moved it slowly down the neck and… "Beep." "There," she said, pointing to a small bump under the skin near the base of the skull. "You see that? That's a chip, but not where we usually find them." Jake leaned closer. "What kind of chip?" Rachel shrugged. "Not a standard pet one. Too deep. Might not even be civilian tech. I've only seen something like this once years ago, when a handler brought in a retired military dog for help after a barbed wire accident. Same location, same signature." Ghost stirred under her touch. His ears flicked, and he tried to rise, but Rachel's calming hands kept him steady. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" she said softly. As Jake watched, she whispered something Elsa, short, clipped phrase in a tone that sounded like command. Instinctively, Ghost shifted his posture. Legs tucked beneath him, ears alert, back straight. Not a pet, not even just a stray. A soldier. "You saw that?" Rachel asked, her eyes narrowing. Jake nodded, stunned. They ran a saline line, cleaned the wounds, applied antibiotic cream. Ghost accepted the care in silence, but his body never relaxed. Every time thunder cracked outside, his entire frame shuddered. Once, when a metal tray slipped from the counter and clattered to the floor, he snapped into a crouch, lips peeled, but not barking waiting. Jake had seen that posture before. In humans. In men who flinched at the sound of popping tires or fireworks. When the treatment was done, Rachel stood back, hands on hips, her brow furrowed. "You picked up more than just a dog, Jake." "I know. I'm guessing he found you." Jake gave a half smile. "Seems that way." Rachel wiped her hands on a towel, then glanced up. "You gonna keep him?" Jake looked at Ghost, who now lay curled on the exam table, eyes half shut but watching him. There was no wag of the tail, no trust yet, but there was no more fear either, just exhaustion. And something else, something broken but unyielding. "Yeah," Jake said. "I think I already have." Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, the thunder distant now, like the world had finally stopped shouting. Jake carried Ghost back to the truck and drove them home through the quiet streets of White Pine, headlights carving a path through the rain. He didn't know what the chip meant, or who might come looking for a military dog left to die in the ruins of a sawmill. But he knew one thing. Whatever Ghost had been, whatever he'd endured, he wasn't alone anymore. The air in White Pine had taken on a sharper bite in recent days, the trees beginning to shed their burnt orange cloaks in a slow surrender to approaching winter. Jake noticed the change in Ghost, first not in body, but in rhythm. The dog, though still thin and skittish, had begun moving with more purpose. He would stand by the door each morning, staring out toward the horizon, ears cocked as though hearing something Jake couldn't, and always Weishi's gaze would shift toward the silhouette of Raven's Mill, as if something waited there unfinished. It wasn't until the third night after the storm that Ghost's behavior tipped into something Jake could no longer ignore. The dog had been asleep beside the fireplace, his ribs rising and falling in a more regular cadence. But then he stirred, sharply, ears up, eyes wide, posture alert. Without a sound, he padded to the front door and sat, tail stiff, body tense. "You want to go back?" Jake asked, half to himself. Ghost turned his head, just enough to meet his eyes. Jake didn't need more than that. They left under the cover of a half-moon sky, driving the short road back to Raven's Mill. The building stood like a broken spine in the darkness, its shattered windows glinting faintly in the starlight. Jake brought a heavy flashlight and his old Army-issued .38 revolver just in case. The air tasted of mildew and iron. As they entered, Ghost took the lead, weaving confidently through corridors Jake had never explored. Past collapsed beams, rusted stairwells, and forgotten pallets of moldy sawdust, the dog moved with the precision of memory. Finally, he stopped at a patch of concrete wall near what had once been the boiler room. He sniffed along the base, then began pawing at the ground. Jake knelt beside him, brushing away debris. That's when he saw Eton outline, a hatch camouflaged beneath decades of dust and grime. He pulled a rusted ring, and with effort, the hatch gave way to reveal a narrow staircase descending into blackness. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered, testing the first step with his boot. Ghost descended without hesitation. The passage below was cramped and cold, the kind of cold that clung to your skin. Jake flicked on his flashlight, casting a shaky beam over concrete walls etched with water stains. The corridor bent slightly, then opened into a room. It wasn't large, but what it lacked in size it made up for in implication. A metal desk stood in the center, cluttered with papers and a map pinned to the wall behind it. Red thread stretched between points marked with codes and names. HW27, Route Black, Birch Point. A filing cabinet sat half open, folders bearing military-style labels. Shelves lined the side walls, housing plastic containers filled with what looked like fertilizer, chemical jugs, and Ziploc bags, some empty, some not. Jake's breath hitched. This wasn't just storage. It was logistics, a distribution node. Ghost moved toward a far corner, his nose twitching. He barked on sharp, urgent. Jake followed and found what the dog had discovered, a bundle of military fatigues in a canvas duffel. The name stitched above the left breast had faded, but not beyond recognition. H. Danner. Jake felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. His hand trembled as he reached out and touched the fabric. He hadn't spoken Howard Danner's name in years. Howard had been more than a squad matee, was the kind of man who laughed in the middle of hell, the one who'd pulled Jake out of a collapsing burn site in Syria, only to vanish 2 weeks later on an intelligence run that had supposedly gone wrong. No body was recovered, just a report, and then silence. Jake never got answers, just a folded flag in a silent room. But now his name was here, in a drug den beneath a sawmill in Montana. Jake knelt and unzipped the bag. Inside, there were more than clothes. A tactical harness, a water bottle, a worn notebook. He flipped through it, and though the ink had smeared with time, there were fragments, coordinates, short notes, references to supply chains. Some of the names matched those on the wall map. Ghost sat beside him, unmoving, eyes locked on the duffel. "You knew him," Jake whispered. "Didn't you?" He couldn't be sure, but the way Ghost leaned into the duffel, pressing his nose into the canvas with a low, mournful sound, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't coincidence. Ghost hadn't led him here by chance. Something connected the dog, Danner, and this operation, something no one wanted found. Jake pulled out his phone and snapped photos of everything. The map, the notebook, the chemicals. He knew it was dangerous, but the world needed proof. Then he turned back toward the stairs. "We can't stay," he said quietly. "Not yet, but we'll come back. We'll burn this to the ground." As he and Ghost climbed into the night, the wind picked up again, whispering through the trees like secrets begging to be heard. The morning fog hung low over White Pine, curling around the pine trunks like fingers reluctant to let go. Jake hadn't slept. Neither had Ghost, who now lay curled on the living room rug, his ears twitching at every creak of wood or distant car engine. The discovery in the underground bunker had shifted something in both of them. Jake had spent the night poring over Danner's notebook, its cryptic notes and half-smeared coordinates gnawing at him like the slow ache of an old wound. But it was the dog's behavior, restless, pacing, ever alert, that made Jake feel like they were running out of time. The call came just after 8 a.m. Rachel's voice was tight, her usual calm replaced with urgency. "Jake, I need you to come to the clinic. Now. Bring Ghost." Jake didn't ask questions. He dressed quickly, clipped the leash to Ghost's collar, though the dog needed no prompting, and drove the short distance through the sleepy town. Rachel was waiting outside, her arms crossed over her gray sweatshirt, dark hair tied back in a tight knot. Her sharp blue eyes darted to the street as Jake parked. Inside, she led them to the back, bypassing two elderly women waiting with their cats. "I ran tests on Ghost's fur," she said without preamble. "And on the sample you scraped from the bunker." Jake nodded. "And?" "Fentanyl. Not trace, potent, pure. This wasn't environmental. Someone's moving it in bulk, and Ghost was around it long enough to carry residue on his coat." Jake's jaw clenched. "He was in that bunker. That stuff's being processed right under our noses." "There's more." Rachel pulled a second plastic vial from a drawer. "This came from the soil around the mill. Same compound. And this," she held up a sealed envelope, "is a copy of the lab report I'm mailing to a contact at the state vet board." Quietly, Jake took the report, tucking it into his jacket. "I'll find out who's behind it." Rachel paused. "You already have a suspect, don't you?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sheriff Thomas Monroe had been White Pine's lawman for over 15 years. In his mid-50s, Monroe had a square jaw, silvering hair, and a reputation for being firm but fair. But Jake had never liked the man's eyes too cold, too calculating, even behind the practiced smiles. And now, with what he knew, Jake had no doubt that Monroe's reach extended far beyond parking tickets and noise complaints. That night, Jake parked across from the sheriff's office and waited. He wasn't disappointed. At 11:12 p.m., Monroe exited the building alone, dressed in jeans and a dark coat. He walked 2 blocks, then climbed into a black SUV parked behind the post office. Jake followed at a distance, keeping headlights off until necessary. They drove south, toward the old logging road that curved around Raven's Mill. Jake parked half a mile out and continued on foot, Ghost beside him. The dog's pace was fluid, his movements silent. They reached the overlook just in time to see Monroe's SUV parked near the old loading dock. Another vehicle unmarked. Newer pulled in moments later. 3 men stepped out, their voices too low to hear, but their body language told the story. One handed Monroe a briefcase. Another lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled. Jake raised his phone and snapped photo after photo. Ghost stayed close, his body tense. When the deal ended, the men disappeared into the night. Jake and Ghost slipped back into the trees. They returned home just after 1 a.m., only to find the front door ajar. Jake's blood went cold. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, no sign of forced entry, but something was missing. "Emma?" Jake called, voice sharp. No answer. A single piece of paper sat on the kitchen table. Just a sentence, printed in block letters. "Back off, or she disappears for good." Emma Rivers, age 10, was Jake's niece. She had come to spend the weekend while her mother, Jake's younger sister Laura, traveled for work. Emma was clever, with big green eyes, freckles, and a stubborn streak inherited straight from the Rivers bloodline. She loved animals and asked too many questions. Jake adored her. Now she was gone. Jake sank into the nearest chair, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. Ghost sat beside him, growling low, head turning toward the door as if waiting for something to return. Jake looked down at the dog. They made a mistake. He didn't sleep. Instead, he planned. By sunrise, he and Ghost were packed. Jake took his camera, a flashlight, Danner's notebook, a utility knife, and his sidearm. He dressed in dark clothes, leaving a note on the table for Rachel just in case. They approached Raven's Mill through the forest this time, circling wide to avoid detection. Jake knew the layout now. He'd memorized the cracks in the walls, the blind spots, the creaking floorboards. They entered through the collapsed maintenance wing. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had gone silent. Ghost stopped short, nose twitching, hackles raised. Jake crouched, listening. A footstep. Then chaos. Voices shouted. A flashlight beam sliced the dark. Jake dove for cover as two men burst from the shadows armed, alert. Ghost lunged without hesitation, his body a blur of tan and gray. He sank his teeth into one man's thigh, bringing him down with a scream. The second man fired once, twice. Jake heard the yelp before he saw the blood. Ghost stumbled, then collapsed. No? Jake surged forward, disarmed the shooter with a brutal strike, and knocked him unconscious with the butt of his gun. Breathing hard, he dropped to his knees beside Ghost. The dog was alive barely. The wound was high on his shoulder, bleeding badly but not fatal. "Hang on," Jake whispered. "I've got you, just hang on." Then a voice echoed through the mill high, thin, mocking. "Looking for the girl, Rivers?" Jake turned slowly. Sheriff Monroe stood at the far end of the room, a pistol in one hand, Emma in the other. Her hands were bound, eyes wide with terror. A gag muffled her cries. "Let her go," Jake said, rising to his feet, gun raised. "Why would I do that?" Monroe smirked. "You've seen too much. You always were too curious for your own good." Behind Jake, Ghost stirred. His eyes opened, his ears perked, and he began to rise. The shot echoed off the steel beams like thunder. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as Ghost collapsed again, a ragged cry tearing from his throat. Sheriff Monroe still held the gun steady, his eyes hard and flat beneath the brim of his dark hat. Emma whimpered through the gag, her small frame trembling in Monroe's grip. But Ghost wasn't finished. Blood oozed from the fresh wound in his side, staining his tan coat a darker shade of red. Yet he pushed forward slowly, painfully, his eyes locked on Monroe. Jake had seen that look once before. In another place, another war. It was the look of a soldier who knew this was the last fight and chose to stand anyway. Jake raised his weapon again, his voice low and firm. "Let her go." Monroe scoffed. "This dog's not going to save you, Rivers." Ghost lunged. Not far, just enough to startle Monroe into shifting his stance. It was all Jake needed. He fired once. The shot caught Monroe in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. Emma dropped to the ground, crying out. Jake rushed forward, scooping her into his arms as Monroe fell back against a steel column, cursing through clenched teeth. Ghost staggered toward them, collapsing again before reaching Jake. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes met Jake's. That was enough. Sirens sounded in the distance. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed Monroe's radio from his belt and called it in, using Monroe's own call sign. "Officer down. Shots fired. Raven's Mill." Immediate response. Then he scooped up Ghost, cradling the limp body in his arms, with Emma gripping his side. They ran through the maze of hallways as smoke began to seep from the floor vents. Jake caught the faint scent of accelerant kerosene, likely. Someone had wired the place to burn it all. The explosives weren't professional. That's what saved them. As the first tremor rocked the rear wing of the mill, Jake ducked through a side door into the forest. Emma coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Behind them, a column of smoke rose, glowing orange at the base. Raven's Mill was coming down. Jake laid Ghost gently in the grass, ripped off his overshirt, and pressed it to the worst wound. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Don't you go now." They made it to the road in time to flag down a squad car. Deputy Susan Coyle, a square-jawed woman in her 40s with graying red hair and a reputation for playing by the book, skidded to a stop. She took one look at the scene. Emma bloody and shaking, Ghost barely breathing. Monroe's radio in Jake's hand said simply, "Get in." An ambulance met them halfway to the clinic. Rachel was already waiting, her clinic lights blazing like a beacon. She ushered them inside with a voice edged in steel and heart. Ghost was prepped for emergency surgery within minutes. Jake stood in the waiting room with Emma wrapped in a blanket, her small hands clinging to his. Her mother, Laura Jake's sister, arrived within the hour. Laura Rivers, a tall woman with sun-weathered skin, wore the lined expression of a single mother who'd fought too hard for too long. She hugged Jake without words and wept as she held Emma. Later, in the quiet of Rachel's back office, Jake handed over a small digital recorder. "I got audio of Monroe and the traffickers. You can hear them talk about the shipments, the payments, and Monroe's voice is clear." Rachel nodded. "I'll get it to someone I trust at the FBI." "What about the sheriff?" Rachel's lips thinned. "He's in custody. Coyle arrested him at the scene. He's denying everything. But this," she held up the recorder, "will break him. Ghost survived the surgery. He would carry the limp for life, but Rachel said it was a miracle he lived at all. Jake stayed beside him every night, sleeping on the floor like he had in the early days. Ghost slept restlessly at first, haunted by dreams Jake couldn't see. But each night, he woke closer. Each morning, he watched Jake with clear, steady eyes. A week later, a letter arrived. No return address, just a postmark from El Paso, Texas. Inside was a single page of handwriting and a photo. The note was from Eleanor Danner Howard's sister. In graceful, looping script, she explained that Ghost had been assigned to Howard in a classified joint narcotics operation overseas. The unit was disbanded after a mission went wrong. Howard was listed MIA, Ghost presumed dead. Eleanor had fought for years to access information but was stonewalled. She learned only recently, through a military contact, that a dog matching Ghost's description had been seen in Montana. The photo was of Howard in full combat gear, kneeling beside Ghost, both of them younger, unscarred, proud. Jake stared at the image for a long time. He didn't need confirmation. He knew. Ghost had survived a war, abandonment, betrayal, and pain beyond language. And somehow, he had found his way back to the last person who could understand. 3 weeks after the fire, White Pine held its Harvest Festival. It was a modest affair: hay rides, baked goods, a pie contest won every year by the same elderly man with shaking hands and the bluest eyes you'd ever see. Jake brought Ghost, wrapped in a navy vest that read, "Do not pet, in recovery." But everyone knew who he was. The crowd parted for them, people nodding, whispering. One boy reached out, and Ghost allowed it a small touch on the head. Progress. Emma found him by the apple stand. She knelt beside Ghost and wrapped her arms around his neck. He stayed still, calm, his tail giving the barest wag. "You're a real hero," she whispered. "Not a ghost anymore." Jake watched them, arms crossed, sunlight warming his back. Ghost turned to meet his eyes. And in that look, Jake saw no shadows, only light. Sometimes the strongest among us are the ones who carry their scars in silence, who fight not for glory, but for redemption. Ghost's journey from a forgotten shadow to a beacon of hope reminds us that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in steps, some painful, some brave, but all worth taking. And it teaches us that loyalty, once given freely, can rebuild a soul and even change the fate of a town. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where are you listening from today. We'd love to hear your story too.